This is Granules of Grief with Refiloe, a podcast breaking down into digestible pieces the big lump that is grief. For those still struggling with its enormity, those unfamiliar, and even those who found a version of living that is somewhat closer to the aliveness they had before the loss. Thank you for being here. Of the millions and millions of podcasts that are out there in the world, thank you so much for choosing to spend your time on Granules of Grief with Refiloe, especially given that this is our first episode and you don't know what to expect. If it makes you feel any better, I also don't know what to expect. No, don't leave, please. Please don't leave. Just join the club. My name is Refiloe and I'm your host for this podcast. I am a Mosotho woman from the Kingdom of Lesotho, a country completely landlocked by South Africa in Southern Africa. I say this because I'm based in the United States, and the number of times I have to explain Lesotho's geographical position in this big world is, leading me to this force of habit, I guess, that Lesotho always has to be followed by an explanation. As I just mentioned, I am based in the US. I live with my husband and two dearly loved children. All children should be loved, if by no one else, by their parents. But I think it's always essential for me to mention and to show and to demonstrate love and gratitude for my children, but for everyone else also in my life. I think this is one of the gifts that grief has given me. And I think if you ask anyone who has been hit significantly by grief, they will tell you that it is never too far from their minds how much the time we have on earth is limited and how much we have to make sure that we have some level of impact on those with whose care we are charged and those we have in our lives. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. This episode is meant to be an introduction to the podcast. And for me, of course, to say just a bit about myself. I will not say too much about myself. I think more than who I am, what's important is what's Granules of Grief with Refiloe. That's one question I'll be trying to address in this first episode. And then I want to talk about what do I hope Granules of Grief with Refiloe will become. So just to wrap up that bit about myself, I am a writer, but much of what I have to share with the world is yet to make it out into the world. I'm sorry. Yeah, like most writers, I am still being charred in the oils of rejection. And, a lot of my life is spent trying to maintain hope in a future for my writing. But enough about myself. So Granules of Grief with Refiloe was born on May 23rd, 2019 in Lesotho when my grandmother died in the intensive care unit of the Queen Mamahato Hospital. If my beloved Nkwambi, or as she's known to many people, Ntabiseng Elizabeth Mabitle, had not died, I don't think that this podcast would have been born. And that's why I'm taking it back to that minute, because although I didn't know at the time that losing her would give birth to a need in me to explore grief, it was certainly that moment that birthed this podcast. It is a direct result of how catastrophically hit I was by losing my grandmother. So wanting to do something about grief is the direct result of how much I was rocked by losing my grandmother, who raised me, by the way, raised me from the time I was about, I would say 11 to the time of her passing in my early 30s. I think like most people, I still struggle to articulate the shattering that happened deep in my soul. When I lost my grandmother, the bludgeoning of my whole being by the experience of her death, it's hard for me to say exactly what it was. And because I've already recorded a couple of episodes for season 1 of Granules of Grief with Refiloe, I know that that's not unique to me. I find that a lot of the people I've spoken to also struggle with articulating exactly how savagely hit they were by grief. I think I was also surprised by how hard hit I was by my grandmother's death because, my grandmother was admittedly a beautiful story. For lack of a better phrase, she was a beautiful story for a woman of her time. She lived a full life. She served her country, but more than serving her country in the 76 years she had of life, she served us. She served her family. She loved my sister and I dearly. Loved my mother when she was alive, loved the whole family. She was love. I think forever, my grandmother and Tabiseng Elizabeth Mabitla will be synonymous with love. Ask anyone who knew her. But like I say, she had a great life. She worked for the country of Lesotho in the health sector. And the part of me that is devoted to family trickled directly from having had her influence. And so I was shocked because she had lived a long life and she had loved us so well. I was shocked by how I spilled out of myself in a way that I could never imagine. I was shocked by the utter despair, the skinning of my soul, the violence of the grief that I felt. I've accepted that I'll never find the right words to explain exactly how I grieved. And I struggle with why I say that the grief was violent. But I think it's because it truly did feel violent. It was like being lifted off the ground violently and then let to hang in the air. I felt like I'd been ripped outside of myself and nothing was left, but even the emptiness that was there was intent on swallowing me. And just feeling very, very lost to myself. The feelings were very aggressive, like being caught in a never-ending storm. It reminded me of a documentary I watched about the tsunami of 2006, somewhere in Asia. And I remember how those visuals, as I talk about my grief, come back to me. Everything felt like a weapon, as it happens in disaster like a tsunami. It felt like everything in the world was attacking me from all sides. There was nothing I could do about it, but just sit and get scraped and scraped and scraped and bleed and have my tears mixed with my blood and everything. It really shocked me. It was so much bigger than me. It felt so much bigger than anything I had ever experienced. And so I didn't anticipate the mental descent that I would take because I had grieved before. I had not had a very conscious experience, I will say, of grief. When you grieve as a younger person, I think it's not like when it hits you in your 30s, like it did me. Before I turned 16, I had lost both my parents who raised me until the age of 11. My dad died of a stroke at the age of 38. And when I was on the brink of 15, my mom died. In that space of time, I had lost my parents, and then I had also lost very dearly beloved members of my paternal family, people who defined my childhood. So I had grieved. And when you have grieved, you assume you have this thing where you think, I'm strong, here I am. And it doesn't occur to you that someday you will be brought to your knees and have to face perhaps everything. And maybe that's what my grandmother's death was. It was a thing that forced me to look back at my life experiences and say, well, you've got a lot of styling to do. And part of that reconciliation, just to touch on a bit about my relationship with my grandmother, is I remember I'd always sit with her. This is a big part of our relationship, this sitting together and affirming each other. It's a lot of affirming that used to happen between us, two-way. I would sit and say, you are my saving grace. I don't know who I would be without you. I would literally sit and look her in the eye and tell her that. And I would say, you saved me. And I think this was in reference to the fact that she raised me after my parents died, but also that she did it so well, that she was such a giving guardian. And I consider her to have been my last living guardian. And I think, one, I had assumed that how fully we gave to each other, how generously and how much we filled each other up. I thought that would have been enough after she was gone. So I was surprised that I still had to go through the fire. I still had to suffer. And not that I didn't expect a level of suffering, but indeed I didn't expect the utter despair that I will talk about in subsequent episodes. But also that perhaps that I considered her my saving grace when my world fell apart as a child. Maybe that is it. Maybe that's why, and maybe not. Maybe it's a collection of issues. But I do think central to how broken I was is the fact that I had considered her to be my everything, my last, in the sense of that kind of familial love, that particular kind of familial love. And I am still sorting through everything. It's been 3 years and I'm not where I used to be, but there's also still a lot of sorting. And that's part of what Granules of Grief is about, to walk with others, but at the same time, to bring myself along in my own story. So in addition to that little brief intro about where I consider Granules of Grief to have been born and which point in my life, I just quickly also wanted to talk about what I hope for Granules of Grief. When I was deep in darkness, I found myself, like in the darkest periods of 3 years that I have grieved my grandmother, I found myself drawn to stories about people who were grieving, who were in the same mental state as me. So I am doing Granules of Grief because I hope it will become for others what it was, what stories of grief were for me in my deepest moments of despair. So I am doing this because it is what I needed in the very early stages of my grief. And I hope it will be and become something that others who are where I was and who are beyond where I was can also come to, that we can build this space of people who speak the same language. What I remember about the very early stages of grief was that I didn't feel like there was a space for my grief, a place for my grief in everyday life. As soon as you say grief, there's that, oh, grief, it's a thing. So I take it you're still hung up on your grandmother. You sort of get that sense when you deal with people who have not been that catastrophically hit by grief. And so this is my hope for Granules of Grief with Refiloe, that it serves as a space for those who need it in one way or another. And those who need it don't necessarily just have to be grievers. Sometimes those who need it are people who perhaps don't have familiarity with the experience of grieving and may get from this podcast a level of understanding, level of compassion, and a level of comprehension, and perhaps some skills and tools from these stories of the guests I'm going to feature on the show, how to deal with people when they are in this darkest hour of their life. Sometimes it's a dark hour, sometimes feels like a dark 3 years, sometimes it's a dark life. For some people, life just never returns. And I think on that note, it might be important for me to also come in and say that this podcast, Granules of Grief with Refiloe, does not intend to substitute counseling. It is not a professional platform. It is a storytelling platform where I personally, I've created enough things in my life to know that what you create can far outlive what you hope for it. And so I'm not entirely sure what it will become, but I know that what it doesn't intend to be is a professional platform where people get, professional advice. It's really a storytelling platform where I will be talking to guests and for this season, mostly to people who have been, on the receiving end of the blows of grief, to hope that in talking to them, we can contribute to the healing of those who have gone through the same or a similar experience, but also the hopes of somehow, as I've already mentioned, teaching those who haven't grieved, how to deal with those who have grieved in that way of having lost someone to whom they were dearly, dearly, dearly attached. So hoping we can come here to speak the same language, but also help those who haven't walked this path to also learn some of that language and how they can contribute to supporting those in their lives who may be going through grief. Personally, I have used counseling to process. I've been in counseling at different points in the past 3 years. I have found it helpful. I will say that I think it is paramount, but it was also supplemented and complemented very well by the stories that I sought online, the stories that I sought in my own life from friends, from strangers about grief. And that is why I am hoping that this platform will be to others what it was to me. Even I'm not fully there yet. And so I'm also doing it for myself. But what is grief? This is also one of the things I wanted to do with this episode, to say, what is grief? Grief is so much, isn't it? And grief doesn't always pertain to death. So I felt it was important for me to clarify that for the purpose of this podcast, and particularly this season, all my promises are only going to go as far as this season. Because, like I said, I don't know what it will become, and I don't know where it will go. But I wanted to say that the grief we'll be talking about will be mainly in relation to death. And I wanted to define it very briefly. I lifted this definition out of the American Psychological Association site. And it's just that grief is the anguish experienced after significant loss, especially the death of a beloved person. And that grief is often distinguished from bereavement and mourning. Because what I found and what was a bit interesting when I was doing my research is that bereavement is more about the condition of having lost a loved one to death. So we call people bereaved based on that condition, that they have lost someone to death. But, individual responses always vary. But however you respond to, having lost a loved one, you will still, I guess, be referred to as someone who is bereaved. Mourning, on the other hand, seems to be more about the process of feeling or expressing grief following the death of a loved one. And it seems to cover, the things we do consciously, like in Lesotho, we have certain mourning processes, like wearing certain clothes to signify mourning, but it also refers to the things we do subconsciously. So I think that's what I just wanted to get out of the way. And we're not going to be a podcast that's really hung up on, semantics and on the meanings of things per se. I just thought that it was important just to get that out there. So very briefly, grief often includes psychological distress, separation anxiety. I had bouts, serious bouts of separation anxiety. And it diminishes for me anyway. It was intense. It was very intense in the beginning. I simply could not be away from my family, my husband and my children, and of course my sister and her children, and a lot of my family members, without thinking that, I thought that around the corner was always something, that there was, the phone couldn't ring without me thinking all sorts of things. I still don't like many people who've received the call. I still don't like, calls at odd hours. And yeah, I'll talk more about myself in other episodes, but I had to single that out because separation anxiety was a big one that I went through in the first year or two that I'm still dealing with now, but at a more manageable scale. So, obviously a lot of confusion when you're grieving, yearning for the person that has passed. A lot of the things that I was talking about had to do with yearning. A lot of the things I described, when I talked about my grief, had to do with the yearning. This utterly excruciating yearning for someone you'll never get back. I dreamt so much of moments of sitting with my grandmother. I begged so hard. I begged God for a miracle, for the impossible. And so I can also identify with that. Dwelling obsessively on the past, and again, some apprehension about the future. So they also mentioned that intense grief can actually be life-threatening. through the disruption of the immune system. And I was very glad they mentioned that, because I had that very experience. And I learned through that experience of grief attacking my physical health because I wasn't dealing with it. And I'll talk about that, as I said. But I was very glad this was mentioned, because it did clarify to me that everything that I had gone through physically was likely tied to the fact that, to how I was responding to my grandmother's death in the first few months, when I went into survival mode, and a lot of things that will come up later. Sometimes self-neglect and suicidal thoughts. I won't say anything about that, but yes, it gets dark. It gets dark. So often there's also regret for something that you consider to be lost, and remorse for something that you might have done. You know, a lot of us go through that, I think. Wishing I'd spent more time with my grandmother, wishing this and wishing that. I had never read this definition from the American Psychology Association. I'd never read it, actually, before the time I took to prepare for this episode. But reading it, to be honest, it felt like felt like I was about to see a picture of myself there. How well it described, almost everything I went through. One of the interesting concepts that I also met as I was searching up some concepts is grief work. And it's explained as the process through which bereaved people gradually reduce or transform their emotional connect to the person who's died, as they should, and focus appropriately on their ongoing lives. And I think this is worth repeating, that a lot of the guests I've spoken to, their grief work has involved counseling. And this podcast, for me, is part of my grief work as well. And I hope that it will form part of others' grief work. I read somewhere, and I wanted to not end this episode without saying this. I thought it was important to put it out there that grief is not a self-improvement project. And this podcast is not a podcast that says, you have to find meaning in your grief, or you have to create. I think what we are really more about is, how have other people managed, if they have, even those who haven't. I have guests who confess that I don't have a big secret. Grief doesn't make sense. We don't expect people to come here and be heroes. I tried the hero thing after my grandmother died. And that's why I ended up in a doctor's room getting some of the worst health news I've ever received in my life. Because if you treat grief as a self-improvement project and don't address the fact that you are down, then it seeps into your body for some people. And I was one of those people. It's very dangerous. And so I needed to get this out there that, no, we're not saying that we're going to come here and be heroes. Sometimes we're just going to come here and be broken. As I learned that I had to be. I learned actually in my journey that I had to be broken. I learned that I was not going to word my way out of this particular experience. I wasn't going to motivate myself. I wasn't going to do that thing where I say, oh, what would she want me to do? I wasn't going to go into survival mode as I did in the first few months. I'm throwing myself into work, being my grandmother's daughter, making her proud. In the end, I was depleted and I had to face grief. Grief chased me and I had to face it. And one of the gifts that I will talk about in my own episodes is that grief has, for me, turned into a quest for self-love. That is one thing that surprised me about losing this person who thought I was the world, losing this person to whom I was, she saw me in a way that no one else, even as loved as I am by other people, no one can see me in that way. And losing that has spurred me inward. I've realized that I cannot be the same person I always was, the same person who mistakes achievement for self-love, the same person who mistakes strength for self-love, the same person who takes a death, as I took many of the deaths that came before, and tries to treat it as something, they can just be toxically positive about. That person could no longer exist. This is what my grief taught me. And so we're not here as a podcast to promote some of those ideas. Sometimes we talk just to make each other feel better where possible. And again, I'm going to end on the hope I have for Granules of Grief with Refiloe. I hope it's going to contribute to someone's grief work. And even if you listen and all you get is a granule that contributes to part of the healing that you're already doing, that hopefully includes access to psychological support, then Granules of Grief will have done its work. Thank you for spending time on this episode of Granules of Grief with Refiloe. I do hope that you got even just a granule of what you need. You can find more information on the podcast on my social media profiles on Instagram at Refiloe and Refiloe on my Facebook page, as outlined in the description box.